Greetings, this is Father Harvey Henderson from St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Grand Forks, continuing with our Pentecost study of the Gospel of Matthew. We begin this week with probably the most familiar piece of Matthew's Gospel, certainly maybe even the most familiar piece of all the Gospels, the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5, 6, and 7, and chapter 5 this week, and 6 and 7 in the next two subsequent weeks. These are a little longer chapters with more content in them, so I'll try to keep my comments brief, and you can struggle and read the text for yourself. This helps to explain to us perhaps why Matthew's Gospel was first in order and the most popular of the four Gospel traditions. It consists of a series of short sayings which would be easily memorizable by a dedicated student in preparation for confirmation in the church, for example. So let's begin with this familiar passage from chapter 5. The first 12 verses are the so-called Beatitudes. Blessed be these different kinds of people. It's important to know that these are statements not of conditional behavior, not you are blessed if you are meek or if you are pure in heart, but that this group of people is said to be the ones who are blessed. And it is blessing much more than happiness. It is a deeper kind of satisfaction than we get from just happy. I know some of the modern translations use the word happy to describe some of these groups of people, but blessedness certainly is a more accurate description of these particular people. So this sets out the beginning of what we call the Sermon on the Mount. It's unlikely that Jesus preached this sermon all at one time and in one place to one group of people, but rather that Matthew, the editor of the Gospel, collected these memorable sayings of Jesus and organized them into some kind of fashion we'll see throughout these chapters 5, 6, and 7. So, beatitude, declaring that certain people are in a fortunate or blessed or privileged kind of circumstance. Matthew's beatitudes are again not practical advice for how one ought to live, but one ought to follow the example of those folks who are pure in heart or merciful or peacemakers or poor in spirit. These are the ones who exemplify best the coming kingdom of heaven that Matthew talks about throughout the gospel story. So in Jesus, the living God is doing a new thing, and part of being part of that new thing are those folks who are blessed in these kinds of ways, setting out a new kind of place. The kingdom of heaven that he talks about here again is not a place, but rather a way of life. The kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of this earth interlock in some kind of mysterious way, and we work towards making God's kingdom here on earth the same as God's kingdom in heaven. So these folks will, by their life, wait for the ultimate validation until God finishes the new creation, until we no longer need to pray that prayer, thy kingdom come. Into this land of promise comes then what would be called the people of the new covenant, the New Testament people. So these Beatitudes, again, a familiar reading. Often we reserve this reading for the Feast of All Saints' Day in and around November the 1st. Matthew then moves on to two short sayings about the fulfilling of the law. Again, I'm using Professor N.T. Wright's division of the pericopes here in chapter 5, here verses 13 through 20. He calls the fulfilling of the law. Can this movement, this kingdom movement, really do the basic things better than its predecessor? Can the kingdom of God be a better place than the kingdom prescribed by the Roman government, for example. So the folks who heard Jesus speak these words would understand what Professor Wright calls a language of revolution. The Jews of his day, this was the fulfillment that Israel had longed for from the time of the exile. Their foreign rulers would be overthrown and God's kingdom would begin here on earth, even though they may have understood that in a violent kind of way. And Jesus surprises them by his kingship, which is one of service rather than one of war or violence. So here Jesus introduces the main theme throughout the gospel story, that the law and the prophets have been fulfilled, as we'll see in chapter 7, to do unto others what you would have them do unto you. This is the message that Jesus puts forward. He uses the metaphors of salt and light, fairly obvious kinds of metaphors. A light is meant to be seen. It's meant to be up on the hill. Jerusalem often named the city of light because it was on the mountain, and reminds us of Jesus' proclamation in John's Gospel that he came to be the light of the world. This light ought to be shown. And again, salt was very much more important in the Middle Eastern world of Jesus than it is in our world for the preservation of food primarily, but also to help the body retain moisture in that very hot kind of climate. So these are the roles of the disciples: to be the saltiness, to be that which brings good taste, good things to the world, and to be the light by which others can see the light of God in the world. So the disciples of Jesus are meant to be this. Passage comes just not too long after the calling of those first four disciples, Peter and James and John and Andrew, as disciples of Jesus. So Jesus holds these things together, and he talks about the breaking in of the kingdom of heaven, not what the Pharisees had imagined, but Jesus tells us all of this. Verses 21 through 26 speak about murder and reconciliation in the society in which we live. Professor Wright talks about these fault lines that often run through individual families and cultures and cities, especially in the time of Jesus. We have a number of passages in which it said that families might be divided, those who accept Jesus as Messiah and those who do not accept him as the Messiah. So these are what Jesus has to say to this particular group. So verses 21 through 26, you shall not murder. Jesus once again takes this Old Testament commandment, this piece of Torah from the first 5 books of the Christian Old Testament, and strengthens or hardens, radicalizes even the commandment that even uttering harsh words against your neighbor is a kind of murder. One need not listen too long to the political debates of our own day to see those kind of murderous, harsh, violent comments that one group makes towards another in the society in which we live. So Jesus encourages a kind of reconciliation, a coming together, a making of friends, even this radical command that if you're there at the temple or in the church making your offering and remember something you have against your neighbor, you ought to go and reconcile with your neighbor first. Lawyers take note that Jesus recommends here settling first of all out of court rather than going to court against your neighbor. So Jesus is alluding to a greater kind of danger. Unless Israel learns how to be God's chosen people, how to shed God's light into the world, disaster is in store for them and for their society. How can people possibly do what Jesus says is a reasonable question here to answer some of this. It seems far beyond our human efforts. Well, this is part of the point of the story, some hyperbole or some exaggeration to make his point. Jesus took the anger of the world onto himself, and he died, in fact, under its weight. And this was the fundamental act of reconciliation for us as the people of God, that the crucifixion and resurrection has reunited us with God, has made us at one again with God as things were in the beginning of time. Hence, this strong emphasis early on in the Sermon on the Mount on this idea of reconciliation, making up with your friends. Every parent knows what this is about in terms of trying to raise children in the world in which we live. We move then in verses 27 and following to what are some of the most difficult words in the gospel story, the question of divorce. Jesus once again takes the question of divorce and doesn't let folks off the hook, but again he hardens that particular commandment, saying that anyone who marries a divorced person commits adultery. Initially, adultery meant that a married woman having sexual relationships with a man to whom she was not married. In our day, we tend to expand the meaning of adultery in some cases for some Christians, that anyone who is not married to one another or to someone else commits adultery if they have a sexual relationship outside of the marriage bond. So what do we do with this? We have in the Episcopal Church, I know, welcomed divorced people into our congregations. They are allowed, indeed, welcomed to receive Holy Communion, and we do in fact now allow for married persons to serve as priests in the church. I remember in seminary one of our professors who refused to come to the Eucharist when another of our professors, who happened to be divorced and remarried, was celebrating the Eucharist that day. Later on in his life, he changed his mind about this, I hear, but that's not too long ago when folks took divorce very seriously. The church still takes it seriously, recognizing that human beings are human beings and we make mistakes, and there is grace there to help us welcome those folks who suffer the pains of divorce. Jesus wanting to make it difficult. Jesus, again, speaking perhaps on behalf of women in his society who were the victims of divorce. A divorced woman often ended up in slavery or in prostitution to make a living. The last section that Professor Wright mentions here, he titles Loving Your Enemies. Again, what might seem an impossible task for many folks in the world in which we live. Israel isn't chosen, Professor Wright says, to be God's special people while the rest of the world remains in darkness. Israel is chosen to be the light of the world, to be what we read in Genesis, to be a blessing to all the nations of the world. This was part of the covenant that God made with Abraham and Sarah. So Jesus is now calling Israel to be that light, to be that salt. The road ahead is dangerous. There are enemies within and without. But Jesus offers justice in the world in which we live. The so-called lex talionis in ethics, which I taught for a long time, the law of the talon, an eye for an eye, a life for a life, some would say was an acceptable form of punishment in the ancient world. Jesus says no more is it this. In fact, if they demand your tunic, give them your shirt as well. If the Romans require you to carry their equipment for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Go beyond what is required. Turn the other cheek. Often a backhanded slap across the cheek was a sign from a Roman soldier, for example, to a peasant. To turn the other cheek would mean to acknowledge the Roman soldier as your equal and have him slap you with the open hand rather than with the back of the hand. This is likely what's behind this. The Sermon on the Mount is about Jesus. It's a blueprint for the life which he is about to live for us, loving his enemies. Father, forgive them, he utters from the cross. We're all familiar with that. This Sermon on the Mount gives us a glimpse, is the kind of the highlight reel perhaps of the words of Jesus, shows that what God is really like. In Jesus we see Emmanuel, God with us. The Son of Man is about discovering the living God in the loving Jesus, and we ought to reflect that love ourselves in the world, as Professor Wright concludes his comments on the Sermon of the Mount. Be perfect as God is perfect. Be not flawless, be not morally perfect, but be complete, be whole. Love God wholeheartedly. This is what Matthew is referring to here as his sum of chapter 5. Be perfect and love God with your whole heart. Blessed are the pure in heart, he says earlier in those Beatitudes. Thanks. Enjoy chapter 5.